Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I've been working on this video off and on for a few weeks now. There's going to be 4 parts in the series, and it's been a lot more difficult than I anticipated it would be, both because of the fact that the man that I'm addressing both here and in the remainder of these videos are disgusting, to say the least, but also because so much has changed and occurred within the movement that we'll be looking at, the alt-right ethno-nationalist movement, that I feel like I should address a few of those points here right at the outset before we get into it. The latest development within this has been that Facebook has decided to eliminate any of the accounts related to ethno-nationalism and other forms of eugenic bigotry, basically. Now, as you'll see later on in the video, first off, I do think that it is a good thing for Facebook to have done, both from a market standpoint and from a social standpoint. What I'm wondering about is what the long-term implications are going to be as groups like this are driven further and further underground. The United States of America has a greater amount of freedom of speech than any other place in the industrialized world. More than most other places in the world, period, for that matter. This freedom of speech is a great source of pride for us as Americans, and yet it does leave the door open for ideas like this to come into the common vernacular, into the public discourse, and do a lot of real damage. Not just because they're bad ideas, but because people like this are often inspired by rhetoric such as what we'll be looking at today. The fact that conversations such as the ones that ethno-nationalists like to have been relegated to the backwaters of the internet doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to go away. It is because of this that I felt it necessary to address some of the more extreme elements of this movement, how people are introduced to it, how they gain an audience, and what can be done about them. I wish there were easy answers to this problem. The one tried and true method of being able to deal with bad ideas is daylight, and that's what I hope to do here. So let's get back to the person that we'll be talking about today, Jared Taylor. Taylor, in my personal opinion, falls right on the line described with the often misattributed quote, "The right to swing my fist ends where the other man's nose begins." Though the man may be, in my opinion, and most others, fundamentally reprehensible, his rhetoric falls right on that edge where, though technically not promoting violence directly, offers a pseudo-intellectual veneer of slick rhetoric, half-truths, and well-placed hyperbole to make the bigotry and eugenic stratification that he tends to promote so commonplace on the far right seem to have a certain degree of validity behind it. Why do ideas and movements such as this seem to be seeing such a strong resurgence in recent years? Why do men like Jared Taylor seem to be regaining an audience? And what does instigation such as this end up leading to? It was questions like this that led me to focus on this particular speech as one I chose to address. It took place in 2012, a campus known as Townsend University. And again, this took place back in 2012. The fact that he was invited to a campus and was able to spread his ludicrous message at a location such as this begs the question, why? Why is he resonating so much, particularly with young, straight white men? How does the dynamic between the political right and left as to what is and is not acceptable allow a man like Taylor to invest his message into the public eye, now more than ever? Perhaps most importantly, how does one respond to people like this without being accused of censorship or further perpetuating the stereotypes that attract some to the message in the first place? This particular video is an exemplary demonstration of how he's capable of getting a receptive audience to his message, using identity politics to embed his more nefarious ideas around what he likes to call race realism, which is really nothing more than eugenics, into central conversation topics. However, to understand why Mr. Taylor is so dangerous, we need to first look at the man and his overall message. Mr. Taylor has a BA in philosophy from Yale and a master's in international economics from the Paris Institute for Political Studies. Although his education and degrees certainly have more academic merit than people like Dr. Jean Kim or Dr. Kent Hovind, he still loves to follow the same path of pontificating with authority on matters that he knows little to nothing about, such as biology, neurology, history. Certainly a formal education isn't required to understand a particular field of interest, but in tactics like this, the veneer of higher education leads to unwarranted authority to the voices of those who, though educated, don't necessarily know the first-hand thing about the subjects they're pontificating about. They're as much a layman as anyone else. However, his education does shine through in one particular respect: rhetoric. The man has a talent for sounding sophisticated and reasonable while spewing nothing but racist BS and dog-whistling to his audience. Now, the segment that we're going to look at today is rather tame compared to some of his other rhetoric, but it gives a good introduction of how he is able to draw an audience before pushing his more radical ideas. That being said, I think that before we get into the video, one needs to understand exactly how much of a bigot this gentleman happens to be. Gentleman, right? So here are a few quotes from Mr. Taylor that give you a sense of exactly how much of a bigoted human being he really is. I want my grandchildren to look like my grandparents. I don't want them to look like Anwar Sadat or Fu Manchu or Whoopi Goldberg. Wow. When blacks are left entirely to their own devices, Western civilization, any kind of civilization, disappears. Fucking classy. And this last one is just a delight. We have a bubbling, successful melting pot in this country, so long as the ingredients are essentially European. Yeah. So if I haven't been able to make it crystal clear already, Mr. Taylor likes to use buzz phrases like race realism as an effective guise to both camouflage his bigotry and utilize reaction to it as validation of the narrative that, quote-unquote, they do not want to talk about his pseudoscience, quote, honestly, because of forced diversity in our jobs and communities, allowing him to take advantage of any controversy around identity politics for perpetuating his own narrative. Anyways, without further ado, let's take a look at the actual event itself and Mr. Taylor's 30-minute speech in front of this large array of university students.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome every single one of you to the first event for the Towson White Student Union. I'm happy to see that we have a totally packed house, which is great. Unfortunately, not everyone in the community gets to come see this event, but for those of you who made it in, I just want to say welcome. And I'm looking forward to everyone getting to hear Mr. Jared Taylor speak. Mr. Taylor is a hero of mine. For the past 20 years, so about as long as most of us have been alive, he's been working with American Renaissance, which is a publication and also an online website, which discusses the idea of race realism. That you do not have to be made of hate to simply acknowledge that there are differences between different groups of people. That the idea of political correctness has so much silenced the idea that we can talk about basic fundamental differences and similarities between groups of people that it's almost insane. Which the idea that this group of the White Student Union is controversial, I think, is proof of that. But Mr. Taylor, he's a Yale-educated man who also got his master's degree studying in Paris. He's well-educated, he's a great hero of mine, and I look forward to everyone getting to hear what he has to say. Everybody welcome Mr. Jared Taylor.
So first off, I did have to incorporate this guy giving the introduction to Mr. Taylor. If you look at this kid, his age, where he is in the world, and his outlook on the world around him, the perception that he has, part of which has been instilled in him by the rhetoric of people like Jared Taylor, Stefan Molyneux, and all the other racist asshats that like to pretend that they have some sort of intellectual validation behind their arguments, have been able to utilize to be able to draw a community towards him. I don't necessarily blame this guy. He's a patsy, as far as I'm concerned. Simply another person that has been duped into finding some sort of message inside of Taylor's rhetoric that he resonates with. The idea in and of itself of having a group of students based on any particular identity isn't a bad thing. But when the identity that you're using is just white, which can include Italian, Russian, German, Polish, Dutch, Swedish, yeah, that's not really an identity. It's a pigment, it's a skin tone, You can look at them in aggregate and see the complex interactions between these different European cultures, but to try and homogenize them all into just white, as he likes to put it, then you don't really have an identity there. But if it stopped at that, and it was just a white students' union, it's distasteful, but it's not something that's necessarily a problem. Yet the first activity that this students' union decided to go through with was inviting this guy to speak. I don't think you can get a clearer demonstration of exactly how duplicitous and nefarious their true intentions are if this is the kind of voice that they want to bring to the forefront through their white students' union. So again, I don't blame this kid, but he's starting something that I don't think he is aware has the disgusting implications that it in fact does.
The issue to be discussed today is whether or not there could or should be a white student union at Towson University. And I think the larger issue really is whether or not whites as a group have legitimate interests that they should form organizations to defend. As far as the student union here at Towson is concerned, I think a logical point of departure for investigating whether or not such a union would be legitimate is to see what kinds of organizations already exist at this university. There is an enormous number of student groups that cater to different interests, different nationalities and ethnicities. Now, what could possibly be the basis for opposing the organization of a white student union? And after all, we live in an era that praises tolerance and inclusiveness. And how can it be that whites and only whites should not be tolerated and should be excluded?
So as we see here, he started right where we thought that he would, talking about the different communities and student unions and, as he likes to put it, minority groups that are able to have their own special club, so to speak, on the campus. And yet it's an outrage for there to be a white students union or a white students club. I understand that that can resonate with an audience of largely young white men, but again, as I had said before, you're not really talking about any particular identity. You've decided to amalgamate all these different groups of white people that traditionally have been on opposite ends when it comes to the in-grouping and out-grouping of acceptable and unacceptable, and just decided to make that into a group for activism, and an activism that has nothing to do with your cultural heritage per se, but much more with the fact that your ancestors were from Europe, whether it be Ireland or Italy or the Czech Republic or France. Just as long as your pigment is pale enough, then you're part of that community, and therefore you can identify yourself as just white. And that's the community that you've decided to develop at this point. In other words, he's basically creating identity politics around a group that has no real identity. The only identity that they have is the color of their skin, and yet somehow, with all the different subcultures that can be described as, quote, white, they've decided to homogenize all those into just this one particular group. A particular group that has a notorious history of reacting violently to anything that either does or could potentially usurp their dominion over most offices, most social institutions in the United States. People are suddenly in positions that just a mere 40 years ago were exclusively available to the highly educated, the wealthy, generally white people. Yet the people that are gaining access to these opportunities that did not have them for generations past are not taking something away from you. Rather, they are getting to the point where they have an equal opportunity for education and employment as their peers, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. The fact that this negatively impacts your dominion over certain walks of life doesn't mean that you're getting your rights taken away. It simply means that the playing field is a lot more level than it was 40, 50 years ago. There's a big difference between those two. But I do recognize that identity politics, so prevalent in society today, regardless of whether you think it is for good or for ill, tends to leave this door open for disenfranchised young men to feel as though they have their own group and that that group is somehow being discriminated against simply because that group that they consider themselves to be a part of no longer has the amount of dominion and social influence that it once did 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, and is a very good avenue through which identity politics can be twisted to nefarious ends. And Mr. Taylor here is a perfect example of that. As we saw earlier from his quotes, he's certainly far more of a racist than he is putting across here. And yet this audience is willing to listen to him because he is actively speaking about an issue that they are concerned about. Whether you consider their concerns to be legitimate or not, it is a good starting point for them to fall down this very dark and self-destructive rabbit hole. There are a good number of voices out there that regularly speak out against modern identity politics. Taylor uses this common ground that he has with somewhat conservative voices to get them closer and closer to his far more radical ideas, which go down that rabbit hole of race realism. But now let's get back into the video and take a look at what he wants to attack next.
One thing that's entirely obvious, certainly in the university context, is the whole question of what's called affirmative action. Well, to give affirmative action its real name, it is racial preferences. And the way racial preferences work is that for certain protected classes, standards are lowered so that they will be admitted to university rather than people of another race. In the case of universities, study after study has shown that blacks and Hispanics can be admitted to university with standard test scores, SAT scores, 100 to 200 points lower out of 1,600 than whites, and with grade point averages equivalently lower.
That just kind of ignores the 99 years, roughly, that we have of segregation in this country after the abolition of slavery. It also happens to ignore the roughly 89 years of slavery that this nation had while it was a country, or the 200 years of slavery prior to that. In other words, there are families, black families in this country, who have been here longer than many Americans, and yet have only had equal access to opportunity since the mid-1960s. I'm sure that there are some of you, maybe even many of you, who have parents, or at the very least grandparents, who were alive and well when segregation was still a thing, when there were colored and white water fountains, when there were colored and white schools, when there were these fundamental inequalities in our social structure. Now, ideally, in our society, it would be great if everything could be judged exclusively off of merit, but we can't. We've shown time and time again that that type of egalitarianism is not here yet. Is affirmative action the best solution? Probably not. And I do think that it gives a person like Taylor great wheelhouse to keep going back to complain about the plight of the white man from. But again, it ignores the realities of what instigated that need in the first place. But it also opens up an avenue through which a person like this can reach a broader audience.
We are constantly being told to celebrate diversity. Well, we can see why Jorge Ramos celebrates diversity. That's because diversity means there are more of his people. That means his language, his heritage, his aspirations, his culture have a larger, more influential role to play in the United States. The same for Asians, the same for all of the groups that are coming to this country and who are the people who are reducing whites from a majority to a minority. Of course they're celebrating. But when you ask whites to celebrate diversity, what are you asking them to do? You're asking them to celebrate their dwindling numbers, their declining influence. You're supposed to be asking whites to say, great, we're giving our country away. We're just going to glimmer away. Hooray, hooray. I can't think of anything quite as sick as that. And the amazing thing is the number of whites who's been bamboozled and browbeaten into thinking that somehow just fading away is some sort of virtuous activity.
So let's take a look at just how valid that particular argument can be. Not very, to be quite honest. And I've already touched on the fact that this idea of there being a white culture is something that's a very recent innovation in our history, because the groups that they like to include as part of so-called white culture are so incredibly diverse and have such an incredibly different history depending on which group you're looking at, that this idea that they are somehow unified culturally or socially is not true. They're unified as Americans. This unification based on the color of their skin is the recent result and outgrowth of running out of people to be able to keep as the outgroup. So the following was printed as an editorial in the Gazette newspaper in Iowa. It was recently reprinted for reasons that I think will become clear as we go through it. Iowa coal operators should think twice before they begin the importation of immigrants and other such people to work in their mines. After they have thought twice, they should decide not to take such steps. Immigrant miners are not wanted. They are not congenial to Iowa. Our people can make no place for them in our Commonwealth. They are not in sympathy with our institutions. They are not desirable elements in the population. With others of similar character, they have cursed Pennsylvania, Ohio, Nevada, and other states. They will not educate. They have poor conception of our standard of morality. They are not self-governing. Whenever they are to be found in considerable numbers, that locality bears every evidence of blight. Life and property is insecure, local government is unstable, riots are a frequent occurrence, murders are a matter of everyday life. Feuds and conspiracies are born with the babe and grow with the man. The pistol and the knife are their arguments. They have no habits that our people can copy with benefit. Whatever they teach is a detriment to the community. They will not learn because knowledge would overthrow their characters and cause them to cease to be the menace they have been whenever colonized in America. If the mines cannot be worked without the aid of such men, let them be closed. No business should be operated in Iowa that will not pay wages on which a man can bring up a family of Americans, citizens of whom the best of their countrymen are proud. Now that delightful editorial, like I said, came from the Gazette newspaper, a local publication in Iowa, and was published in 1895. The only things that I changed inside of this entire editorial was every time that it said the word immigrant, the original paper had in its place the word Italian. Links to the original article will be attached in the description below as well. It's still the same old scare tactics used for ages to determine who falls into the in-group versus the out-group. There's a dangerous resurgence of racism not only in the US, but all over the Western world. Men like this are at the forefront of it all. They have an audience that's listening, and it's not going to go away. Ideas like this are like herpes. They hide, they spread, they flare up again, and then they go back to hiding right under the surface. Anytime that it's seen, it needs to be addressed. Anyways, thank you all for listening. I appreciate it. This one was a hell of a tough one to research and then write to be able to add to this. Other than that, any questions, comments, feedback, concerns, as always, are all welcome. Thank you very much for listening and have a great day. Bye.